Splatoon has weapons. A lot of them, in fact. And within that selection, there are all sorts of different stats and quirks that make each weapon what it is. From basic shooter weapons and their variants to highly specialized and gimmicky classes like sloshers and stringers and so on, there is no shortage of unique options to choose from. Many of these weapon classes revolve around specific mechanics that create their identities, like Brellas with their shields and shotgun-like way of firing, sloshers with their janky physics and projectiles, and more. These defining characteristics are pretty simple to identify, and every player picks up on these things more or less immediately after experiencing a weapon for the first time. However, these are far from the only mechanics that go into how Splatoon's weapons function in practice. There are a lot of extra stats and mechanics that influence the entire weapon roster, many of which the average player may have no idea about. Today, we're exploring some of these hidden mechanics to help you gain a deeper understanding of your favorite weapons and become a smarter player. Hello, I'm Pika, and welcome back. Calling the mechanics I'm about to talk about hidden may seem strange or confusing, so let me explain what I mean. These game mechanics are largely universal across all weapons, yet are never given a clear explanation to players in-game. To have learned about these things, you either need to play enough to passively notice and figure out these things on your own, or have learned about them through some external source, like this video. For some players, this may all be new information, while for more experienced players, you may have come across some of these things already. With that said, it really would be amazing if the game itself did a better job of explaining these mechanics to its players, or just being clear about how weapons worked fundamentally to begin with. For all the positive things I tend to say about this game, this has always been one part that really bugs me. I mean, come on guys, what do these stat bars even mean? There are no numbers, and no specification on what the labels even refer to in some cases. There's nothing objective or intuitive about this in-game data. That topic deserves a more proper analysis another time though. A quick disclaimer before we begin. I am no programmer, game dev, or data miner. I am just a nerd who has put too much time into this game and is very interested in its mechanics. Any particular stats that I reference are from the game parameters that have been made available by the data miner Lean, which I will link below. This also means that my understanding of these things is from my interpretation of these stats and from my own testing and that of others that I have heard about. If I say something wrong or don't use the perfect terminology for something, then blame me, not anyone else. That being said, I have spent a lot of time studying and testing this stuff, so I am fairly confident in my knowledge on the surface level things that we'll be covering here. Let's start our list of hidden mechanics with something simple. One time-based mechanic that isn't well explained by the game itself is ink recovery cooldown. This is the time it takes after using a main or sub-weapon that has to pass before you can start replenishing your ink tank. You may have heard this mechanic be referred to by players as quote-unquote white ink. This is because the cooldown time is visually indicated on your ink tank as a white segment that shrinks down until it's gone, after which you will begin recovering ink again. Every main and sub-weapon has a frame count associated with it that determines how long this white ink time will be. Main weapons with multiple functions can also have different times for each action. Brellas are an extreme case of this, as deploying their canopies induces much longer cooldowns than just firing from the weapon. Splat Brella, for instance, has 60 white ink frames after firing, or 1 second, while launching the canopy results in twice as long of a cooldown at 120 frames, or 2 seconds. Sub-weapons have a wide range of white ink times, with all bombs and many utility subs having at least 1 second if not more. Ink mines and beacons, on the other hand, have very few white ink frames, letting you recover ink almost immediately after deploying them. Interestingly, chargers and stringers as classes completely lack white ink frames, likely thanks to similar visuals being used while holding a charge. While on the topic of ink tanks, another quick trick related to them is how your ink tank gets instantly and fully refilled whenever you activate a special. This goes for every special in any situation. However, where this effect is most felt and is easiest to take advantage of is with specials that are quick to deploy, like Killer Whale, or throwable specials like Inkstorm or Tacticooler, since these give you quick access back to your main and sub weapons after using them. A personal favorite of mine involving this mechanic is running a double Fizzy Bomb gear build with Inksaber sub on weapons like the Tri-Slosher Nouveau and Bamboo Mark II, then immediately activating and using my special and throwing 2 Fizzy Bombs again right after, thanks to the free ink tank refill. Even without devious tricks like this though, this mechanic is still a useful one to know about, as a well-timed special right as your ink tank is running low can keep you in the fight for a lot longer than your opponents may be expecting. Next, let's talk about weapon mobility. What likely first comes to mind when I say this is weapon strafe speed. This is quite simply how fast or slow your character can walk around while your weapon is engaged. Usually this is in reference to actively firing with your weapon, but strafe speed also applies when using other functions like charging a shot or using your shield with a Brella. Every weapon has its own assigned strafe speed, which plays a big part in how the weapon feels to use and move around. For example, the 96 Gal feels a lot slower to play than your standard spider shot does, despite them both being in the same weapon class. And this is due to the combination of 96's slower fire rate and much slower strafe speed compared to other shooters. This is all rather simple and intuitive, and I wouldn't really call it a secret. However, it's not the only mechanic responsible for determining how fast you can move with different weapons. That's right, we have a hidden stat at play here too. You see, every weapon is assigned one of 3 weight classes, those being light, medium, and heavy. The majority of weapons in the game are medium and don't have any altered movement speeds. For a select few other weapons though, their weight class affects how they move around at all times. Light weapons have a slightly enhanced default swim speed and run speed while not firing compared to other weapons, and heavyweight weapons are the opposite. These weapons move around a bit more slowly by default. To help counteract this though, the different weight classes receive different returns for any run or swim speed up that they have equipped. A small amount of swim speed up on a heavy weapon will equate to a much larger percentage increase in your swimming speed compared to the same amount being run on a lightweight weapon, for example. For this reason, using even just a sub or 2 of mobility perks on these heavyweight weapons will make them feel a whole lot better to play if the slow movement speed bothers you. This mechanic is one that many players will feel the effects of in-game and will naturally pick up on, but it can take a while to naturally figure out which weapons belong to each weight class. Alright, I think we're warmed up and ready to get a bit more into the weeds now. This next secret mechanic is going to take a fair bit of explaining, but I promise it's an interesting one. There is something about how the game handles projectiles that lets you manipulate the range of your weapon, and it may be one you've subconsciously picked up on depending on what weapons you play. Have you ever noticed while using bombs that the projected path that they'll take shifts around pretty significantly with your own movement? If you're moving forwards when you throw a bomb, it'll travel farther than if you're standing, and if you're backing away, it'll come closer to you. This effect also gets more powerful the faster you are moving. This works by the game taking the current velocity of your player's movement and adding it to the projectile. If you're moving forwards in the same direction as you're throwing your sub, then the velocity is added to the initial velocity of your sub and you end up with faster motion. If you're moving backwards compared to what you're throwing, then your velocity will be subtracted from the projectile's velocity and it will go slower. If we assume that in either case the projectile will be in the air for the same amount of time, then faster motion results in more range, and slower motion will give less range. This is a brutal simplification of what's going on in the game's calculations to make this happen, but it's enough to understand the basic idea and make use of it. If you didn't know about this already, then now you do. What a lot fewer people know about this though is that this doesn't just apply to throwable subs and specials, but to most main weapons as well. For every weapon class other than Splatanas, Chargers, and Stringers, the same movement manipulation can be used to increase or decrease your range slightly. You don't just have to take my word for this though, as we can find a clear example of this in-game. Take the range blaster into the lobby, and line yourself up so that a target dummy is just at the end of your direct shot range. You can easily do this by aiming at a dummy from out of range, and then moving towards it until your reticle gets highlighted. You can take a shot while standing still to confirm you're within range. Now, maintain your aim on the dummy and briefly tap to walk backwards. What you'll notice is that your reticle briefly goes dark while you're walking backwards, then should return to being highlighted once you're stationary again. This is the game showing you that during that moment of walking backwards, your direct shot range will no longer connect with the target. This is due to its velocity being temporarily reduced, and therefore also its range. If you return to your starting point and time a shot while tapping backwards, you'll see that it does indeed fall just short of a direct hit. If you're standing still from where you ended and take a shot again though, then your next shot will once again be a direct, despite you not moving from the position that just a moment ago wasn't able to connect that shot. You could test the exact same thing with forward momentum. This time, start by standing just outside of where a direct shot would connect and briefly tap forwards. You'll notice the opposite thing happening this time. Your reticle shows that it'll hit a direct shot only for a brief moment that you are moving towards the target. So if you ever feel like a blaster player that you're fighting seems to spontaneously change their weapon's range in different situations, that's because they unironically are capable of doing that. Again, this goes for a lot more than just blasters, but they are the best at showcasing it. Generally, the slower the base velocity of the weapon, the more this range increase will be felt. This means things like blasters, sloshers, brushes, and rollers will often get the most out of this knowledge. The best part of all of this though is that you can argue that holding forwards into your fights genuinely buffs your weapon and running away from fights nerfs it, and that's pretty hilarious. We've covered some useful tricks and information so far, but unfortunately not all weapon mechanics work in their users' favor. Some mechanics work to add inconsistency and limitations to weapons. We'll be ending things off by covering one of them here, that being RNG. For those who don't know, RNG stands for Random Number Generator. It is a term thrown around when referring to anything within games that is effectively random or feels luck-based. In this context, we're referring to RNG related to weapon accuracy with standard firing weapons, those being shooters, dualies, and splatlings. Switching through different weapons in these classes, you can see how the shape of your crosshair changes slightly. This is indicating the potential shot spread of your weapon, or how far of an angle away from the center of your aim that deviating bullets can go. Where RNG comes in is determining the frequency of that deviation. It may be a surprise to many, but the weapon classes mentioned before have variation in how often their bullets deviate depending on what the player is doing, tending to get more inaccurate the longer you fire, and also after jumping. In other shooter games, this mechanic is often called bloom. To start us off, every weapon has an assigned chance of your first shot fired deviating to the edge of your weapon's spread. This value is always quite small, so in general, you expect your first bullet to fly straight on target. For the spotter shot, the first shot deviation chance is a tiny 1%, though it can get higher, such as the highest being 10%, shared by the Splattershot Nova, Dowser Dualies, and entire Splatling class. After firing a shot, the chance of the next bullet deviating is increased by a set amount, regardless of whether or not the previous bullet was accurate, and increasing further for every bullet after. This deviation chance can be recovered though, and this happens when you stop firing your weapon. After you've lowered your weapon, your deviation chance will quickly decrease for every frame elapsed, or 1/60th of a second, and will continue to do so until you either shoot again, or the deviation chance falls back to its first shot probability. Just like that first shot deviation, the rates of both increasing and recovering bloom also vary for each weapon. The Dowser and Tetra Dualies gain increased deviation at the harshest rate of an increased 4% per bullet, while NZAP has the least punishing increase of only 0.5% per shot. It makes up for it with a slow 0.5% of deviation recovery per frame of not firing as well though, while many other weapons are between 1 and 2%. These deviation probabilities also have upper limits to them. For most shooters, they cannot exceed a 25% chance for their shots to drift while their user is standing on the ground, but Splatlings and the close range spray shooters can go higher, with the highest being Aerospray, which maxes at 50%. If you've ever played this thing, you know that checks out. These caps also change while jumping though, as in addition to your shot spread becoming wider while jumping, your deviation will also be immediately set to 40%, even if this value falls outside of the weapon's normal deviation range. Just like in other games, what this bloom mechanic is intended to do is make you be more intentional about when you choose to use your weapon and for how long. In general, you're going to struggle more in your fights if you spend long periods of time firing to lay down turf and then immediately transferring your aim over to a target. In this case, your bloom will have been maxed out before you even start fighting, and you'll not have had any time to recover it. Especially with shooters and dualies, firing in bursts and taking short pauses between is a useful habit to pick up. Thankfully, Splatoon itself encourages us to do this, since we gotta find time to recover ink and swim to reposition ourselves quite often anyway, so this is just another reason to get more efficient and intentional with that rhythm. The drastic effects that jumping has on a weapon's shot spread and deviation encourages a similar kind of consciousness. Because of the aim penalties induced by jumping, it's important to be careful about when you choose to jump in a fight while using these weapon classes. While that quick movement mix-up might be nice, it might not be worth it if it causes you to miss a bunch of shots after it. That is, unless you're using something like the Splash-O-Matic or Squeezer in its tap fire mode that has no deviation of any kind despite being shooters. These weapons cheat the system and don't have to care about any of what I just said. No wonder they're so good. And that just about does it for the mechanics we're covering here today. How many of these did you already know about? Originally, this video is going to be about how Splatoon's weapons fundamentally work, getting all the way into the details of how bullets move and how their range is determined and all sorts of stuff. However, that ended up being way too long for one video. Go figure. I figured it would be best to take all of these smaller but more interesting mechanics and make them their own video first. But if that original video concept sounds interesting to you, let me know, as the script for that is effectively already done if I ever want to get back around to it. Anyway, that's all from me, so thanks for watching and have a good one.